At exactly 14:23 Zulu time, the South China Sea erupted into chaos. The nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt CVN-71, a 100,000-ton symbol of American naval supremacy, suddenly found itself surrounded by 17 Chinese warships in a perfectly executed maritime ambush. The Type 055 destroyer Nanchang had led the encirclement, positioning itself just 8 nautical miles from the American carrier's starboard side, well inside the 12-mile exclusion zone that U.S. carriers typically enforce. The collision alarm shrieked across the Roosevelt's flight deck as radar operators watched in disbelief. Chinese vessels had appeared from seemingly nowhere, materializing out of the morning haze with their fire control radars already locked on target. Beijing believed it had just cornered the U.S. Pacific Fleet's crown jewel, forcing Washington into an impossible choice: retreat in humiliation or risk a shooting war that could spiral into World War III. But what the People's Liberation Army Navy didn't know was that this very moment had been anticipated, war-gamed, and prepared for in the most classified briefing rooms of the Pentagon. And the American response would not come from the carrier itself, but from assets the Chinese didn't even know were watching, waiting to turn hunters into prey in a display of military technology that would redefine naval warfare in the 21st century. According to analysis by naval warfare experts, the Chinese operation was the culmination of a 72-hour intelligence blackout that Beijing had imposed across the entire South China Sea. Starting 3 days before the encirclement, Chinese maritime militia vessels, hundreds of them disguised as innocent fishing trawlers, had dispersed across the region carrying sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. At precisely 11 o'clock Zulu, this dormant network activated simultaneously, transforming into a massive distributed jamming array. The commercial Beidou navigation satellite signals that civilian vessels rely on remained untouched, but military GPS frequencies, specifically the encrypted Mode 3 signals that U.S. naval forces use, were flooded with sophisticated spoofing data. The navigation systems aboard American destroyers suddenly displayed positions that were off by 3 to 5 kilometers, not enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to create fatal confusion during high-speed maneuvers in congested waters. Simultaneously, the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force activated its ground-based electronic warfare stations on Hainan Island and the Paracel Islands. The Type 305B radar jammers, operating on multiple frequency bands simultaneously, created a curtain of electromagnetic noise that effectively blinded the U.S. Navy's E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft. The radar operators aboard the Hawkeyes, flying their standard patrol patterns 200 kilometers from the carrier strike group, watched their screens dissolve into static. The tactical data links that normally paint a real-time picture of every vessel within 400 kilometers went dark. The USS Roosevelt and its escort ships were suddenly operating blind, stripped of the information superiority that American naval doctrine depends on absolutely. But the most sophisticated element of China's trap was not electronic. It was acoustic. For the past 6 months, Chinese submarines, specifically 3 Type 093 Bishan-class attack submarines, had been secretly mapping the underwater topography of the Roosevelt's patrol zone with unprecedented precision. They used passive sonar to record the acoustic signatures of the carrier's nuclear reactors, the distinctive blade rate of its propellers, even the specific humming frequency of its air conditioning systems. This data was fed into an artificial intelligence system that could predict the Roosevelt's location with 87% accuracy based solely on ambient ocean noise, without ever actively pinging and revealing the submarine's position. When the Chinese surface fleet moved in for the encirclement, these 3 submarines were already positioned in a perfect triangle beneath the American carrier, at depths ranging from 150 to 200 meters. Their torpedo tubes were flooded, warheads armed, targeting solutions locked. The message was clear: any attempt by the Roosevelt to maneuver aggressively would be detected instantly, and the carrier would find itself in a shooting gallery with no escape route. On the bridge of the USS Roosevelt, Rear Admiral Patricia Hernandez faced a crisis that no American carrier battle group commander had confronted since World War II. Her screen showed 17 Chinese warships, all within striking distance. The Type 055 destroyer Nanchang alone carried 112 vertical launch cells loaded, with a mix of YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles and HQ-9B surface-to-air missiles. One salvo from the Chinese fleet could overwhelm the Roosevelt's defensive systems through sheer numbers. The SM-6 and rolling airframe missile interceptors aboard the American destroyers were designed to handle saturation attacks, but not at these close ranges where reaction time drops to less than 60 seconds. Worse still, with GPS spoofing corrupting her navigation data and the E-2D Hawkeyes blind, Admiral Hernandez couldn't accurately coordinate her escort's defensive postures. The Link 16 tactical data network that normally synchronizes the entire strike group's air defense was fragmenting, showing ghost contacts and delayed position updates. The tactical situation deteriorated further when Chinese J-20 stealth fighters, 4 of them flying in a loose finger 4 formation, appeared on the Roosevelt's air search radar at a distance of just 45 kilometers. They had approached from the northwest, using the radar shadow created by a tropical storm system to mask their approach until the last possible moment. The J-20s did not lock their weapons, did not adopt attack profiles, but their very presence was a threat. They were close enough to launch PL-15 air-to-air missiles at the Roosevelt's orbiting F/A-18 Super Hornets before the American fighters could react. The Chinese were demonstrating total information and positional dominance. Beijing had effectively created a local A2/AD bubble around the carrier, a maritime exclusion zone enforced not by international law but by raw military power. At this point, if you believe the United States has a way to break this encirclement without firing a shot, comment breakout below. If you think Admiral Hernandez has no choice but to surrender the initiative and order a humiliating retreat, comment retreat. Try to guess what asset the Pentagon will deploy that China never saw coming. The initial American response followed standard operating procedures exactly as Chinese planners had predicted. From Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, 2,400 kilometers away, the U.S. Air Force scrambled 6 B-1B Lancer strategic bombers. These aging but still potent platforms each carried 24 AGM-158C LRASM anti-ship missiles, stealthy weapons designed specifically to hunt warships in contested environments. The plan was simple. The B-1Bs would approach at low altitude, staying beneath the Chinese fleet's radar horizon until they were within 200 kilometers, then simultaneously launch 144 missiles in a coordinated swarm attack. The sheer volume of incoming threats would force the Chinese ships to go defensive, breaking their encirclement pattern as they maneuvered to protect themselves. This would create gaps in the ring around the Roosevelt, allowing the carrier to punch through and retreat to safer waters. But Chinese military intelligence had studied American bomber doctrine for decades. As soon as the B-1Bs lifted off from Guam, their heat signatures were detected by Chinese early warning satellites in geosynchronous orbit. The data was instantly relayed to the PLA rocket force, which activated 6 DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile launchers positioned in Guangdong province. These weapons, nicknamed carrier killers in Western media, have a range of 4,000 kilometers and carry maneuverable re-entry vehicles capable of tracking moving targets. But the DF-20SIXS were not launched at the Roosevelt. They were aimed at a point in the Philippine Sea directly along the B-1B flight path. At 1647 Zulu, 6 missiles broke through the cloud deck, each releasing a specialized payload, chaff canisters containing millions of aluminum-coated glass fibers and radar corner reflectors. The effect was immediate and devastating. The low-altitude corridor that the B-1Bs needed to use for their approach suddenly became a radar environment so cluttered that the bombers' terrain-following radars could no longer distinguish between real mountains and false returns. Flying at 200 meters above the ocean at 900 kilometers per hour, the margin for error was zero. The mission commander, a lieutenant colonel with 3,000 flight hours in the B-1B, made the only rational decision. He ordered the formation to climb to 10,000 meters to clear the chaff field. But at that altitude, the bombers were immediately painted by Chinese ground-based radars, S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries that China had deployed on artificial islands in the Spratlys locked on. The bomber crews received the dreaded warbling tone in their headsets indicating SAM launch. They had no choice but to deploy countermeasures and turn back, jettisoning their unfired missiles into the ocean to reduce weight for the escape maneuver. The bomber strike, the pride of U.S. long-range power projection, had been neutralized without a single shot fired. Parallel to the failed airstrike, the U.S. Navy deployed its underwater trump card, the Virginia-class fast-attack submarine USS Illinois SSN-786. which had been conducting intelligence gathering operations 150 kilometers southeast of the Roosevelt's position, received orders to penetrate the Chinese encirclement and threaten the enemy submarines from behind. The Illinois was arguably the most advanced attack submarine in the world, equipped with a fiber optic towed array sonar system capable of detecting targets at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers in optimal conditions. Its Mark 48 ADCAP torpedoes had a demonstrated kill rate of 98% against surface ships in testing. The Illinois' captain, Commander Rachel Torres, was confident in her ability to slip through the Chinese cordon undetected. But confidence in submarine warfare is often the prelude to disaster. As the Illinois approached the outer edge of the encirclement zone at a depth of 180 meters, traveling at a silent 5 knots, its sonar operators detected something unexpected. The underwater environment was saturated with acoustic clutter. China had deployed dozens of unmanned underwater vehicles, UUVs, each the size of a torpedo, programmed to emit randomized noise patterns that mimicked everything from whales to submarine machinery. Some emitters were stationary, anchored to the seafloor. Others moved slowly on battery power, creating the illusion of submarine contacts. The Illinois' advanced sonar processing algorithms, which normally excel at filtering biological noise from mechanical signatures, were overwhelmed. The sonar screen showed 40-plus potential contacts, any one of which could be a real Type 093B submarine in firing position. Then came the moment that turned the situation from difficult to catastrophic. At 17:15 Zulu, the Illinois' hull-mounted passive sonar array detected a specific acoustic signature, the distinctive whine of a CZ-6 pumpjet propulsion system operating at low power. This was the signature of China's newest submarine, the Type 095 tank class, a boat that Western intelligence had only grainy satellite photos of and zero acoustic data on. The signature was coming from bearing 047 degrees, range estimated at 12 kilometers. But simultaneously, the towed array picked up an identical signature from bearing 183 degrees, range 9 kilometers. Then a third contact, bearing 290 degrees, range 15 kilometers. Either China had deployed 3 of its most secret submarines to this single location, or the acoustic decoys were so sophisticated that they could replicate classified signatures that shouldn't exist in any database. Commander Torres faced an impossible decision. If she maneuvered to evade, she risked creating flow noise that would reveal her position to genuine enemy submarines. If she went active with sonar to burn through the deception and identify real targets, she would announce her location to every Chinese platform within 50 kilometers. If she fired torpedoes blindly, she could hit a decoy while giving away her position, resulting in certain retaliation. The Illinois was paralyzed by information warfare, trapped in an acoustic maze with no clear exit. The underwater advantage that American submariners had enjoyed for 70 years had evaporated in a single engagement. Back aboard the USS Roosevelt, the situation had become untenable. Both the air and subsurface rescue attempts had failed. The Chinese encirclement was tightening, with the closest destroyers now at 5 nautical miles and closing slowly, methodically. Intelligence intercepts picked up from Chinese military communications indicated that Beijing was preparing to issue an ultimatum. The Roosevelt would be ordered to reduce speed to 5 knots, accept Chinese navigation assistance vessels coming alongside, and proceed under escort to a safe anchorage near Hainan Island. It was a demand for de facto surrender, a humiliation that would shatter American credibility in the Pacific and embolden every adversary from Tehran to Pyongyang. In the White House Situation Room, the National Security Council had convened an emergency session. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs laid out the grim options. Option 1, order the Roosevelt to comply with Chinese demands, trading short-term humiliation for the safety of 5,000 sailors and the carrier itself. Option 2, authorize the carrier strike group to break out by force, accepting that this would result in casualties on both sides and likely escalate to a broader regional conflict. Option 3, threaten nuclear retaliation, a bluff that nobody in the room believed China would accept and that could trigger the very Armageddon it was meant to prevent. Every option ended in either capitulation or catastrophe. But then the Director of National Intelligence interrupted with a single word, Aurora. The room fell silent. Aurora was not a weapons system. It was not a ship or a missile. Aurora was a protocol. a contingency plan developed in absolute secrecy over the past 5 years by a joint team from DARPA, U.S. Space Command, and Naval Intelligence. It had never been tested in real combat conditions. Its existence was known to fewer than 40 people in the entire U.S. government, and it was predicated on a technology that most military planners still considered science fiction: autonomous swarm warfare using space-based coordination. The president, after a 12-second pause that felt like an eternity to everyone in the room, gave the authorization. Execute Aurora. Non-lethal configuration. Make it obvious. 1922 Zulu. From Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. A routine payload aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. Officially listed as technology demonstration satellites for the Space Development Agency. Received an encrypted command sequence transmitted via laser comm from a ground station. The payload consisted of 40 small satellites, each about the size of a shoebox, that had been in low Earth orbit at 550 kilometers altitude for the past 8 months. Their public mission description mentioned optical imaging and communications relay testing. Their actual purpose was far more lethal. These were not satellites in the traditional sense. They were kinetic weapons platforms, each carrying a single tungsten penetrator rod weighing 9 kilograms. But unlike the rods from God orbital weapons that conspiracy theorists fantasize about, these were not designed to destroy targets on the ground. They were designed to create precisely controlled electromagnetic pulses by detonating small-shaped charges in the upper atmosphere, ionizing the air in very specific patterns. The physics were complex, but the effect was straightforward. By detonating at calculated altitudes and coordinates, the satellites could create temporary disruptions in the ionosphere that would affect radio wave propagation in predictable ways. But the Aurora system didn't stop with space-based assets. Simultaneously, for U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, which had been loitering 400 kilometers away from the Roosevelt's position conducting routine anti-submarine training, changed course and sprinted toward the carrier strike group at maximum speed. As they approached, each aircraft began dropping sonobuoys, not the standard passive listening devices, but active acoustic transmitters operating at very specific frequencies. Within 20 minutes, 160 of these buoys were scattered across the ocean surrounding the Chinese encirclement. They began transmitting simultaneously, not random noise, but carefully orchestrated acoustic pulses that created interference patterns in the water. The third component of Aurora involved assets that the Chinese didn't know existed. For the past 18 months, the U.S. Navy's Unmanned Undersea Vehicle Squadron 3, operating from a classified facility in Darwin, Australia, had been deploying small autonomous submarines throughout the South China Sea. These vehicles, designated XLUUV Alpha, were roughly 10 meters long, powered by lithium-ion batteries and hydrogen fuel cells, and capable of operating independently for up to 90 days. Their mission was pure intelligence gathering. They would position themselves near key shipping lanes and Chinese naval facilities, recording acoustic signatures and gathering electromagnetic intelligence. They were not armed. They carried no weapons. But they had one capability that made them invaluable: mesh networking. 1945 Zulu. The Aurora protocol synchronized all three systems, space-based, airborne, and underwater, into a single coordinated swarm. The satellites began their atmospheric detonation sequence, creating carefully shaped distortions in the ionosphere directly above the Chinese fleet. These distortions acted like lenses, bending and focusing radio waves in ways that natural atmospheric conditions never could. The effect on Chinese radar systems was immediate and baffling. The Type 346B phased array radars aboard the Type 055 destroyers suddenly began showing false contacts, hundreds of them, appearing and disappearing at random. The radar operators tried to compensate by switching frequencies and waveforms, but every adjustment seemed to make the problem worse. The radars weren't being jammed in the traditional sense. They were being subjected to atmospheric propagation effects that no electronic warfare doctrine had prepared for. Simultaneously, the network of sonobuoys activated their acoustic interference protocol. The carefully timed pulses created standing waves in the water, zones where acoustic signals were amplified and zones where they were canceled out. The Chinese submarines' passive sonar arrays, which depended on detecting the faint sounds of enemy vessels, were suddenly flooded with acoustic artifacts that appeared to be submarine signatures but were actually just interference patterns. More critically, the interference made it impossible for the submarines to maintain accurate targeting solutions. The torpedo fire control systems kept losing lock, showing position errors that jumped erratically by hundreds of meters. Launching torpedoes under these conditions would be firing blind, with no reasonable expectation of hitting the target. The XLUUV Alpha unmanned submarines, which had been lying dormant on the ocean floor for weeks, suddenly activated their secondary function. Each vehicle rose to a depth of 50 meters and began transmitting on very specific frequencies the exact acoustic signatures of Chinese Type 093B submarines that the vehicles had recorded during months of intelligence gathering. Within minutes, the underwater environment around the Roosevelt was flooded with phantom submarine contacts, all of them broadcasting authentic Chinese sonar signatures. The three real Chinese submarines, already confused by the acoustic interference from the sonobuoys, now found themselves surrounded by what appeared to be friendly vessels in impossible positions. Their captains faced a nightmarish decision. Were these real friendly submarines that had been deployed without their knowledge? Or were they enemy decoys? Opening fire could mean sinking their own boats. But the most devastating blow came from an asset that nobody, not the Chinese, not most of the American crew, had anticipated. The USS Roosevelt itself had been quietly modified during its last maintenance period at Naval Station Norfolk. Buried deep within the carrier's island superstructure, technicians had installed a prototype directed energy weapon system designated N/SEQ-4. It was not a laser designed to burn through targets. It was a high-power microwave emitter, capable of generating 10-megawatt pulses in the X-band frequency range. Its purpose was not to destroy electronics, but to temporarily overload them with energy, forcing protective circuits to shut down systems before permanent damage occurred. At 20:03 Zulu, the N/SEQ-4 system fired its first pulse, aimed directly at the Type 055 destroyer Nanchang, now just 8 nautical miles away. The microwave pulse, invisible to the naked eye, struck the destroyer's phased array radar panels with the energy equivalent of a lightning strike concentrated into a surface area of 3 square meters. The protective circuits on the radar system did exactly what they were designed to do. They detected the massive energy surge and immediately shut down the radar to prevent permanent damage to the sensitive electronics. The Nanchang's primary air search radar, its fire control radars, its electronic warfare systems, all went dark simultaneously. The effect cascaded across the Chinese fleet. The N/SEQ-4 could pulse every 12 seconds, and the Roosevelt's targeting team methodically walked the beam across every Chinese warship within a 15-kilometer radius. One by one, their radars shut down defensively. The ships weren't sinking, weren't burning, but they were effectively blinded. The captains could see the American carrier with their own eyes, but their weapon systems had lost lock. Their surface-to-air missiles couldn't track targets. Their anti-ship missiles couldn't receive mid-course guidance updates. The Chinese fleet had been transformed from a coordinated wolf pack into a collection of isolated, confused vessels, each one uncertain of what was happening and unable to coordinate with the others because their data links had failed. And then came the final element, the one that would ensure this humiliation would be photographed and transmitted worldwide. From the Roosevelt's flight deck, 2 MQ-25 Stingray unmanned aerial refueling drones launched. But they weren't carrying fuel bladders. They were carrying sensor pods. These drones climbed to 15,000 feet and began circling the Chinese fleet, their high-resolution cameras recording every detail. The footage showed Chinese warships with dead radars, their crews scrambling on deck, frantically trying to reset systems. It showed the Type 055 destroyer Nanchang, Beijing's pride and symbol of naval modernization, sitting motionless in the water with smoke rising from its radar mast where circuit breakers had blown. It showed, undeniably and humiliatingly, that China's encirclement had failed completely. At 20:31 Zulu, Admiral Hernandez gave the order. The USS Roosevelt increased speed to 25 knots and turned southeast, directly toward the gap between 2 Chinese frigates whose radars were still offline. The escorting destroyers USS Milius and USS Fitzgerald formed up on the carrier's flanks, their Aegis combat systems now fully functional and locked onto every Chinese vessel in the area. The message was clear: the Roosevelt was leaving, and any attempt to interfere would be met with overwhelming defensive fire. The Chinese ships, still struggling to restore their systems, could only watch as the American carrier strike group steamed away. No shots were fired, no missiles launched, but a humiliation had been inflicted that would echo through Beijing's military establishment for years. The Chinese submarines faced an equally stark choice. They could fire torpedoes at a target they couldn't accurately track, likely hitting nothing while revealing their positions and inviting immediate counterfire from the now alerted USS Illinois. Or they could remain silent and let the Roosevelt escape. The submarine commanders, trained to be cautious and aware that unauthorized offensive action could trigger a war, chose discretion. They remained hidden as the American carrier group withdrew from the area. 72 hours later, the geopolitical consequences began rippling outward. The footage from the MQ-25 drones had been transmitted in real time to Pacific Command and from there to every U.S. ally in the region. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, all received the same message. American technological superiority in naval warfare remained intact. China's much-hyped Type 055 destroyer, marketed to potential customers from Pakistan to Argentina as the future of surface warfare, had been effortlessly neutralized by systems that didn't even exist in public military budgets. Beijing faced a propaganda disaster. State media initially tried to spin the incident as a routine training exercise that had been successfully completed according to plan. But commercial satellite imagery from Planet Labs and Maxar showed the Chinese fleet retreating to Hainan Island with damaged crews visible working on radar masts. Independent maritime tracking data showed the Type 093B submarine surfacing unusually close to shore, a sign of mechanical or operational difficulties. The narrative that China had cornered an American carrier fell apart under scrutiny. But the incident had exposed secrets that the Pentagon had hoped to keep hidden for several more years. The Aurora Protocol, the space-based ionospheric weapons, the acoustic interference network, the microwave emitter on the Roosevelt. All of these programs were now partially revealed. Chinese military intelligence would be working overtime to develop countermeasures. The next confrontation would not be susceptible to the same tricks. The technological advantage was temporary, as all advantages are in modern warfare. 3 weeks after the incident, a classified report reached the White House from the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was brief and chilling. Chinese military R&D facilities had accelerated work on 3 specific technologies. First, hardened electronics resistant to microwave pulses, using gallium nitride semiconductors instead of traditional silicon. Second, AI-driven sensor fusion that could detect vessels even when traditional radar and sonar were compromised, using combinations of visual, infrared, and gravitational sensing. Third, and most concerning, a new generation of anti-satellite weapons specifically designed to target small satellite constellations in low Earth orbit. The battle for the South China Sea had not ended. It had simply moved to a new phase, one where each side would be more prepared, more cautious, and more dangerous. The Roosevelt incident would be studied in military academies for decades as a textbook example of non-kinetic warfare. But it had also established a new template for confrontation, one where technological surprise could turn the tide of battle without firing a shot. The question that haunted Pentagon planners was simple: what happens when both sides have exhausted their technological surprises and the only option left is actual violence? And here is the uncomfortable truth that military analysts worldwide must confront. The Roosevelt incident succeeded precisely because it was unprecedented. The Aurora Protocol worked because China had never encountered it. The next carrier that finds itself encircled will not have that advantage. The weapons and tactics will need to be new, even more exotic, even more untested, and at some point, in some future confrontation, the technology will fail or arrive too late, and the shooting will start, not because anyone wants war, but because both sides have painted themselves into corners where backing down is politically impossible. This is the new reality of great power competition in the 21st century. Victories are temporary, advantages erode, and the window between successful deterrence and catastrophic escalation grows narrower with each incident. The South China Sea is no longer just contested waters. It is a weapons testing ground where the next global conflict will be prototyped in real time, with real ships, real sailors, and real consequences for billions of people whose lives depend on decisions made in those crucial moments when technology either works perfectly or fails catastrophically. That is the full picture of the most sophisticated naval confrontation in modern history. A battle won without a shot fired, but which set the stage for even more dangerous confrontations to come. In your opinion, was the Aurora Protocol a masterstroke of deterrence or a reckless gamble that brought us closer to war? Leave your analysis in the comments. If you found this tactical briefing offers perspectives that mainstream media won't cover, hit like and subscribe immediately. Turn on notifications for the next deep dive into military technology that's reshaping global power. For now, this briefing is concluded. Stay vigilant.